Please take your Bibles and turn to Exodus, the second book in the Old Testament. So if you're using one of the Bibles that are in the seat racks before you, you'll find that text on page 45. So just after the first book, which is Genesis, and then Exodus. We're going to examine together the all the way through chapter 2, verse 10 this morning. So we're going to take big chunks. We're not going in little bitty bites all the way through the book. We're going to take big chunks. And so I'm going to do this almost in kind of a narrative way. So we're going to read texts and think about those texts. I'm not going to read the whole text and then go back and break it down. But this morning, as we look through this, remember that the emphasis in this first section is that a deliverer is born. And his name is Moses, and he pictures the deliverance that Christ will one day bring to his people. And so even in the Old Testament, the gospel is explicitly laid out for us. And as we look through this text, there are some things that we want to learn about how God has dealt with his people. And primarily this morning, I want you to come away with a deep-seated confidence in the sovereign rule of God as he is orchestrating his purposes and the events of your life in the same way that he orchestrated the events of Moses' life toward the ends that he has ordained. So in no less a way is God involved in the events of your day and your life than he was in the life of Moses. All right? So we're going to come away from this with a sense of confidence and trust and patience, and then being actively involved in what's going on around us as God is working out his purposes. So you need to see how these people respond and what's going on in this text in order to encourage you to be confident that so that you can trust God is at work when things like Las Vegas happen and people around you at work and in the school and where you're going to school say, yeah, where was God when this guy's standing in a hotel room mowing people down? Where was God when all that's going on? And you need to have a confidence that God's providence and sovereignty is alongside even the evil that's going on in the world, that God has not winked or blinked or turned away. You need to be able to trust him, and you need to also have patience that God is working out his purposes, and then think about how you can be involved. What do you need to do? How do you take action in such a day? So those are the things that we want to learn, and I'm very excited about through this book because of the way that it is woven together with the rest of the Pentateuch. Now, I didn't say that word just to impress you because I know a multiple syllable word, but because it's a good word for you to know. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch, and they are written by Moses and inspired and given to us by the Spirit, and they are all woven together to show and reflect the effects of the fall and the moving away from God that takes place in the lives of his created people, and then how he reverses that fall and brings them back into his presence and back into a relationship with himself. All 5 books are working to prove that point and to demonstrate it. And there's a question that rings out through the entire 5-book collection, and it's expressing the longing of the hearts of the people who have been separated from God. Who is going to bring us back into God's presence? Who will ascend the hill of the Lord? Who will go into the presence of this holy God and not be killed and crushed and wiped out because of their sin? Who has clean hands and a pure heart? Who has not lifted up their soul to falsehood? Who has not sworn to vanity? Who will go into his presence and live? Who will ascend the hill of the Lord? And these 5 books are teaching the answer to that question is Jesus. And it pictures it for us in various ways. Reading through this is almost like reading Tolkien. And the ways that there are pictures and events drawn out. So I want to encourage young people especially. Some of you have never read this book before. Begin to dig through the book of Exodus with me as we go and see how it is a continuation, first of all, of the book of Genesis. The first book of Exodus, or the first lines of Exodus, begin with the Hebrew word and. And so it's a sequel to Genesis. Genesis is a prequel, if you will, and maybe we'll do that someday. So we'll be kind of in line with Star Wars. We'll do what comes later first, and then we'll go back to the future, and we can do all that stuff together in the years that God gives us ahead. But it's a continuation of what's been going on in Genesis, and it takes what has been tearing down and the process that men have been going through as they sin against God, and the glory of the Garden of Eden results in exile and being cast out of God's presence. And it results in the destruction that comes in the flood, Noah's flood, or the mountaintop experience, if you will, of Ararat, where the ark rests, and the new beginning, and then the degradation down into the Tower of Babel. And we see this on and on and on again as Joseph then winds up in Egypt, and the last lines of the book of Genesis tell us, and Joseph died. And then it takes us right on into the book of Exodus by saying, and these are the names of the sons of Israel which came to Egypt with Jacob. I'm really excited. Jacob, each with his household. And he talks about Joseph's brothers, as we read last week. And all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died. All the generations that went with him. And so we're reminded again of this going down into the grave, or this being moved away from God, the effects of the curse of the fall that have fallen on all men and on us as well. They went to this place and they died. But there's also the language of reversal. Listen to the last part of verse 6 when the scriptures say, verse 7, Joseph died, all his brothers and all that generation, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied. Now, does that language remind you of any language that may have been in the book of Genesis? The creation language and the mandate that God gave to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. And so God's intention and purposes have not been thwarted by the curse that fell on men. His intentions and purposes have not been cast aside when people live and then they die, and there's all this disobedience and chaos and difficulty. His intentions and purposes are being worked out, and the creation mandate is still being fulfilled in the people of Israel as they greatly multiplied, even in this place of difficulty that we know as Egypt. And Exodus is a narration of the redemption of God's people as they're delivered through the water and then on into the land, and as they're brought into God's presence once again. It's interesting, this creation language even occurs in the destruction of Egypt as God uses the forces of creation and he brings a disintegration of Pharaoh and his armies and all of his people through the forces of creation, and yet then out of that brings a birth of a new people, the nation of Israel. So those are some of the things that are going on in Exodus. That's enough to get us all excited about reading the book, I hope. At least it is me to be excited about it. As God is reversing things, he's keeping his promises. Remember the promise of the reversal of the curse in Genesis 3:15, when God said, I will bring from the seed of the woman, and his seed will crush the head of the serpent. Remember the promises that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 15 and 17, when he tells him that there's going to be a people and they'll be too many to number, too numerous, and that from the seed of that people will come the blessing for all nations of the earth. And so as we see the response or the results of those promises, we can think about how this is a continuing work of the promise of God. My desire for you this morning is to learn that we can trust God's sovereign power, we can be patient under God's sovereign timing, and then we can take action as obedient servants to the one King. The way we want to think about that is in these two ways. First of all, there's a picture here of a king who would be God. And the title is Pharaoh. We have no idea what his name is. He's never named in the book. But his title is Pharaoh. Now, there are many in royal positions sit on a throne that they believe and established by God, and that God appoints them to that position of royalty. Pharaoh went a step further than that, and he was the incarnate son of the sun god Ra. And so he thought himself to be deity. And All those who held that position thought in that same way. And notice that when in verse 8, he talks about, Moses records for us the arrival of this Pharaoh. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And I think there are a couple of things that we can discern from that. And the first, obviously, he doesn't remember the things that Joseph did. He doesn't know about the way that Joseph kept Egypt alive through his understanding of the coming famine. And then he also does not give any recognition to Joseph's God. And so there's this distinct disconnect from the things that would have made Egypt a place of comfort and provision for the Israelites because of this new Pharaoh who power. That's what he says in verses 9 and 10. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." His intention, then, as he considers himself to be one who is wise, and he has particular purposes that he wants to work out, he says, "Here, this is my plan, and here's my way of getting there." And so he exalts himself against the very creation mandate of God and the intentions of God to have a people that fill the earth and that serve the one true King. He says, "They will be my servants. They will do my bidding. They will accomplish my purposes, and I will be the ruler over them." He is the personification of the kings. Psalm 2, when the psalmist says, "The kings of the themselves, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords." You'll remember that later in chapter 5, verse 2, Pharaoh will be hearing Moses saying, "God, as people go, I don't know this God. I don't know who you're talking about. So I don't care what he says." How many people live in that precise place today? I do not know this God. I don't care what he says. And some of you may be sitting in this room in that very same place today. Some of you may be disconnected from God. You have no relationship with him, and at least you're curious and you're here. And so I want to say thank you for being a part of our fellowship today. Thank you for being a part of this meeting and from hearing about this one true God. And as you're sitting here today, I'm praying that you will submit yourself to him as your king, and that you'll begin to understand what it means to from doing your own desires, pursuing your own ends, and going in the route of Pharaoh. Because that's what you are either today following in the footsteps of Pharaoh and serving his king, Satan, following after him in obedience, or you are following after God as your one true King and Savior. And so I'm praying that you'll be able to discern where you are in that today, and that you'll follow after Christ. So Pharaoh says, "Let's deal shrewdly." His intention is to control and rule over Israel. And he goes through a threefold, increasingly wicked plan to achieve his purposes. First of all, he decides to enslave them, and we've read about that. Notice verse 11 says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them," that's over the Israelites, "to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses." Look down to verse 13. "So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work as they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." And this is the lot of the people of Israel under the rule of Pharaoh. And this is the lot for every person who is not in right relationship with Jesus Christ. To bitterly serve, to be under a taskmaster who is building his own kingdom, if you will, who's building his own cities, and you are a part of that if you are not a part of following after Christ. And see that distinction that's being set up here for us in the book of Exodus. Pharaoh's intention is to force them to build cities for him. And then when we'll see, what we're going to do is talk about intention and then God's response. Okay? So we're going to be skipping back and forth a little bit. The second intention that Pharaoh has when that doesn't go well is to secretly reduce their number by killing babies at birth. Look at verses 15 and 16. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. And so the intention of Pharaoh was to secretly have the midwives take the babies away from their mother if it was a male, and just do away with him. And I don't know what he would have had them tell the mothers. Maybe they could say there was a complication, your baby didn't survive childbirth. But there was this intention of just working with the midwives to reduce the number of males. I'm grinning because it's ironic. Pharaoh should have been more worried about the women, because it's the women in this account that thwart him. But that's just probably a parenthetical gig, right? So Pharaoh's, and notice again that he is attacking and going after the very creation mandate of God. God calls his people to be fruitful and multiply. Pharaoh's out there trying to kill babies. Thirdly, he openly calls for genocide when that doesn't go so well. And he commands all in the kingdom, all Egyptians, to kill Hebrew babies by throwing them in the Nile River. So they're to find the male babies. If there's one born, or if a mom's trying to hide one, if they see a male baby, they're to take it and throw it into the Nile River. Notice in verse 22 these instructions that are given. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So we see the wicked intent of the heart of Pharaoh in direct opposition to God. And I want you to hear the phrase that Pharaoh is working in direct opposition to God, because this is not just the historical account of a mean king and Moses and their battle with each other. This is a conflict of cosmic proportion. This is a conflict of Satan and God, and Satan's servant and what God intends to accomplish. And these are set apart from each other. But notice this as well. There is no contest here. It's not a battle in that sense that they're waging back and forth and struggling for position, because at every attempt of Pharaoh to thwart the designs of God, God crushes Pharaoh's intentions. And so let's think about that now. Seeing the king who would be God, but let's see more the who alone is God. Is wise. Pharaoh wants to deal shrewdly, but God is the one who brings purposes to pass. And I continue in Psalm chapter 2 with verses 4 and following. He who sits in the heavens laughs. God's not threatened by Pharaoh's shrewd plans or intentions. God's not worried that he's not going to accomplish his designs. He sits in the heavens and he laughs. The Lord holds Pharaoh and all who would oppose him in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my on Zion, my hill. This is my world. This is my kingdom, and you are but a part of it. And if you will oppose me, you will be crushed. So I appeal to you again today. You may consider yourself one who is opposed to God, one who is going to make your own way, to deal shrewdly with him and to accomplish your own purposes. But there is no future in that. And so I call you away from that today. And I encourage you, where you are as you are, to hear that God alone is the one that you should serve. Kiss the Son while you may, lest he be angry with you and destroy you. Submit to Christ today. Repent of sin today. Turn to Christ now and cry out to him. Jesus, make me your child. Make me your servant. Make me your subject. Bring me into your kingdom. Rescue me from this wicked king who has nothing in mind for me but my destruction. Wake up and listen to the call of God upon your life through this Old Testament book of Exodus. Glory with me as we see the greatness of this God. Pharaoh would enslave the people, but when oppressed, they multiply. Look back to chapter 1, verse 12. The more the people of God, the Israelites, were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they started this plan, afraid of the multiplying Hebrews, and so God just makes them multiply more. And he overturns Pharaoh's intention to hold them down, to keep them from multiplying. The God of heaven intended. And so rather than Pharaoh allowed to kill the Hebrews, the God of creation shows his power over life and death to humiliate the false gods of Egypt and to save his people out of slavery, bring them into the promise. Moving in that direction. Secondly, Pharaoh killed the babies via the midwives, but the midwives obey God. Look with me at verses 17 through 21. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this, and let the male children live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Now, again, ironically,